Hi everyone, it is once again Captain of the Ring from the radio of the Dread Elves. As I promised you in the latest video, I'm going to tell you the story of a battle that I've played against one of my friends, Nicola, a couple of weeks ago. I've decided to give this battle a name, which is Dead Men Tell No Tales. This is kind of self-explanatory because, my friend plays the undead, therefore you can expect rotting zombies, crippling skeletons, and some interesting monsters, and all this army is run and puppeted by two important heroes. Of course, Dead Man refers to that, but also some other things that you're going to see in the following slides. Moving forward, I'm going to explain you the specific rules of this battle, which are the deployment type, which is encircle. As you can see, there are two yellow areas, the one for the attacker and the one for the defender. In this battle, the attacker is going to have the option to deploy his units much further on the flanks, while the defender is going to have a wider center, allowing him to move right to the center of the board, where usually the objectives are placed, but also this is going to expose his flanks to the attacker's maneuvers on the flanks. The secondary objective, which is besides the main one, which is to kill as many units of the enemy as possible, is going to capture the flags. This means that each player is going to choose 3 units from the enemy's army, and the player which is able to destroy the higher number of these 3 chosen units is going to win 3 additional points at the end of the battle. I also show you the army lists. Mine obviously is the one that I showed you in the previous video, which is the triumvirate one, while my opponent decided to bring an interesting army. As you can see, he has 2 heroes, which are the Vampire Lord and the Necromancer. The Vampire Lord is a very tough character, that's because it's a vampire, so it's very tough to hit and wound, and also is a very good fighter. This means that fighting a Vampire Lord in a one-on-one combat is quite complex, because they're very hard to kill, at least in the first strike, which is where my heroes usually shine the most. But of course, this vampire has the main ability to improve the weapon skill, so the fighting capabilities of the unit in which it is in. This is also kind of scary for me, because this means that if the Vampire Lord goes into a unit of skeletons, those skeletons are going to be as good fighters as my elves, which takes away one of my advantages. Then he has a Necromancer with the lore of Evocation. This is a very powerful mage, not quite as powerful as mine, but still a very good caster, and the spells mostly deal with empowering his troops to hit and wound better, or to reroll their hits, which is even scarier, and also to do potentially some range damage to single characters, sniping them out of the units in which they are. Finally, for heroes, he has 3 Banshees, which are basically ghosts. They're able to fly across the battlefield and to scream the enemies away with powerful screeches, which do range damage. Very scary against elves, because as I told you before, we don't have that much defense when it comes to range damage. Then his main blocks are 20 zombies. These guys are very weak. They basically are a bunker that is going to stay behind his lines in order to protect the Necromancer, probably. 40-ish skeletons with halberds. This might be one of the scary blocks. And another big block of heavy skeleton warriors with great weapons. These 2 blocks are very scary, because I know that my units singularly are not able to deal with them, only because of the numbers. My only chance to destroy them as quickly as possible is to sandwich them between 2 of my units. If I'm able to engage them in the front and in the flank with something interesting, I might be able to get them down to being absolutely broken, but it's going to take a little of a strategical approach. Then finally, he has 13 Shades, which are a unit similar to the Banshees, because they can fly basically across the board, and they also provide some flying damage if they move over units. He has 2 packs of 8 wolves. These are chaffing units, similar to my light cavalry, so they're going to get in the way of interesting charges, blocking me from doing the one thing I need, which is sandwich enemy units. He has a shrieking horror, which is a big bat monster that is also able to shriek, so he's able to scream and do damage by range. And finally, a unit of 10 bat swarms. This unit is a weird way to chaff. You have a lot of wounds in this unit, so it's very hard to destroy them. They're not very good in combat, but their main role again is to block important units, allowing his army to kill everything else. So moving on, I will show you the deployment. At the end, I got the attacker position. Of course, this is exactly what I wanted. My opponent has the vampires, and this forces him to have all of his units close to the general, which is the necromancer. This is why he chose the center, so the defender role. This is very good for me because I like to move across the flanks thanks to my cavalry. So, starting from the left side of the table, my deployment has the warlocks, which are the hybrid unit, in part caster, in part fighter, which have magical attacks, which is very useful against the unit of shades that you can see behind with sights. Then I have some fast cavalry, my spearmen across the battle. In the enemy's position, you can see the shrieking horror, so the big scary monster that screams, a pack of 8 wolves moving to the right. Then he has the big block of heavy skeleton guard with great weapons. Behind them, you can see the shades. Moving again to the right, you can see his bunker with the zombies, and right in front, another unit of 8 wolves. Finally, to the right, you can see his skeleton warriors with halberds, and within them there is the vampire, so that means that that unit has weapon skill 6, and they are very hard to fight against, even for my elves. Here you can see a much better picture. You can see all the units that my opponent has, because they are all grouped in the center. And finally, there is the bat swarm to the right of the skeleton warriors. In my center, again, you can see right to the right of my spearmen, you can see a hunting chariot with a harpoon launcher, my altar, which provides the fear bubble, basically across the center of the table, which is very good because that's where the fighting is going to be, since my opponent does not have that much range damage. Another unit of fast cavalry, my crossbowmen with the mage in it, the Miss Leviathan right behind them, and finally the Black Guard, which is going to be my main hope to destroy infantry units, the second hunting chariot, and my unit of knights with my general, the prince, in it. Moving forward, I also got to start with the first turn, and this is the move that I decided to make with my army. Now I know that it's going to go for a very fast approach to the center of the table. That is because it needs to get as much space as possible to get close to the units. He chose to destroy my Black Guard, the unit of knights with the general in it, and my spearmen, while I had to choose his 3 infantry blocks. So the skeletons with great weapons, the skeletons with halberds, and finally the zombies in the back. So my move is to encircle my opponent as much as possible and to get in range with my shooting. This is because I have an advantage in that regard, or at least I feel like it, so I need to kill as many units completely as possible in order for him to not revive any dead models. Of course, being an army of the undead, he's able to raise that every time that a unit is not completely destroyed. So, I start my encircling maneuver by moving my cavalry very close to his lines on the right. My crossbows get in range of his main center lines, while the rest of the units adjust to get in range or to move in better positions. On the left instead, my cavalry does pretty much the same thing. In the magic phase, I get a pretty good amount of dice, which are going to be used to cast spells. I try to go for a Touch of the Heart, which is one of my spells that is going to kill one dog. I decided to do that just because I want to get rid of that chaffing unit as fast as possible, because they can be annoying. My opponent lets it go because it dispels pretty much the rest of the spells. He's very afraid of area damages, which I'm able to do, because his units are not that good in defense against range damage. So he lets it go, and I kill one of the dogs. And he also lets go Altered Sight on my crossbows, which allows them to shoot much better. Of course, we move on to the shooting phase, and I decide to shoot all of my arrows into the unit of dogs right in the center of the field. So I shoot with the crossbows and also the harpoon launchers on the chariots. And as a result, the first kill of the game is mine. The full unit of dogs is dead. This means that they are not going to come back, and this is a great start of the game. Moving on to my opponent's first move phase, he decides to consolidate his position. So he moves all of his units all close to each other. Again, this is very good for me because I'm able to shoot again and to kill something else potentially, and this is great. Also, his Shrieking Horror comes right back to the center, and he faces his right flank, where my hybrid cavalry is. That's because my cavalry is very scary for his shades, that you can see with the sights in the back, because they deal magical damage against which that unit is very vulnerable. And so he wants to be able to deal with them with something scary and to keep them at bay. For the rest, his units just shamble forward, the dead don't move that much, and they just get better angles on everything. Now, we move on to my second turn. His magic doesn't do that much, and he is not in range with any screamers, so I move my fast cavalry right in front of his infantry blocks. I do this because I want to get much closer with my close combat units, and I also need to get in a position where he's not able to charge me right across the table. So as you can see, the cavalry goes right in the middle, preventing them from moving anywhere else. And basically the rest of my army stays put because I want to just shoot my enemy to bits, essentially. My fast cavalry on the left moves a little closer. Again, I am out of range of any potential threats, because if he wants to move his screamer to come and deal with them, he must come out of the march bubble of his general, which means that this bat screamer is going to stay right out of the game for a lot of time, which again is very good for me. I get another decent magic phase. I'm able to blink some wounds off of the bat swarm, which it's okay, it's nothing great, but it's fine. I'm also able to blink a wound off of the Screamer, thanks to Touch of the Heart again. And then we move on to my opponent's second turn. In his move, he declares 2 charges with both his main blocks onto my fast cavalry, which was preventing him to move. I decide to flee. Now here's something wonky happens. As you can see, he declares first the charge with his halberds with the vampire in it, and I flee from them, and I roll a pretty good number. Then he opts to do the same with actually, he also declared another charge against the same cavalry unit with the heavy weapons, and I decided to stay from that one. So this means that I flee only from the halberds, as you can see right on the top of the screen, and he has to chase with the great weapons, but he doesn't roll a great number on the dice, and so he actually does not catch my unit, and he is stuck behind them. Also, he's not able to complete the charge anyway with the halberds, so he opts to declare another charge against another unit. As you can see here, I failed the panic test with my hunting chariot, which has to flee as well. With his halberds instead, he declares a charge against my crossbows. This is perfect for me, because I know that they need to get out of the way in order to get the tower guard or the black guard where they need to go and to smash some faces. So I declare a flee reaction with them too, and they bounce right behind my halberds. You can also see right in the top that he moved his bat swarms right in front of my cavalry to basically chaff them and stale them for some time. As you can see here, I can show you that he didn't catch me by 1 inch. If he had rolled one number higher on the dice, he would have caught me, and then it would have been a completely different game. He also gets a pretty good magic phase. With that, he's able to move his units. I don't want that to go off because that kind of defeats the purpose of my moves, which is to keep him as far away as possible for the longest time. So I try to dispel that one. But at the expense of him reviving the wounds that I took off from the bat swarm, which is a price that I have to pay. He also gets Whispers of the Veil of my crossbows. This is a very interesting play, because in order to get them to turn back and fight again for me, I need to roll a discipline check. And this spells that he throws lowers my discipline by 1, which makes it much harder for me to actually get them back on the field. This was a very interesting play, and if I fail, I'm going to lose my main range damage unit and also my mage, which could be crippling. I try to dispel it, but he gets a high number, and so I'm not able to. So we go on to my turn, because there is no fighting, and I decide to just go in at this point. I charge my knights into the bat swarm, because there is nothing else I can do, and I also get closer with my chariot to shoot at his big scary monster. I also manage to rally my fast cavalry. Since they are fast cavalry, they are also able to turn back and put themselves right in the position that they basically did before, which is great news because now the enemy is chuffed again. As you can see at the bottom, I also managed to rally my crossbowmen, which is a great relief for me because otherwise it might have been a very bad game. Now I know that my opponent is going to move even closer to me, and so I decide to go for a gambit. If his units come closer, I'm looking at the skeletons with great weapons. I know that I can sandwich them potentially on 3 fronts because I also plan to fight with the tower guard that is just out of the frame on the right. For this reason, I move my hybrid knights much closer to the center to charge them in the flanks. I get my spearmen much closer to his unit because this is the plan. I need to sandwich them, kill them all in one go, and then turn to face the rest of the army. I also managed to get a quite interesting unity in divergence on his skeletons with halberds. My opponent kept all of his dice to dispel this spell, but actually I managed to roll higher, 4 dice against 5, so I was very lucky. The damage results in me killing 8 or 10 of his skeletons, which is a pretty good amount. In the combat phase, I lose 1 knight against his bat swarms, but as you can see, I've killed 7 of the swarms, which actually means doing 20 wounds, more or less, of damage, so this is very good. You also have to know that the undead, once they lose combat by a certain amount, they also lose wounds, because they cannot flee, being undead and not having a brain, but they just crumble to death by the excess of winning points that you have in the combat. So again, the number of wounds helps to crumble them to death. But alas, I'm not able to break through them, and I'm still stuck with these bat swarms. So now we move on to my opponent's third turn. As you can see, he decides that it's time to stop being passive, and he just goes for it. He moves both of his infantry units charging my fast cavalry. This time I stay because otherwise he's going to be too close to my units and I cannot afford it, and also that helps with the plan. He also moves his shooter units, so the screamers, both the big scary bat monster and also the specters with the scythes right on top of the hill to look at my hybrid cavalry in order to scream at them. He also moves his zombies in a way to try to chaff me up, and he moves out his necromancer, which is the single model that you can see right in the middle of the picture, just to be out of any combat. He gets a pretty decent magic phase, and this is where my battle plan kind of goes in the trash can. I keep all of my dice to dispel his spells that allow him to move units, because I don't want him to do the sweeping attacks while the unit with scythes moves across or over my units. Because I know that once he does that, he's going to be in my backfield and he's just going to destroy my units without being in my front arc. And so I'm not going to be able to deal with this unit of specters. But unfortunately, as it happened before, my opponent rolls 4 dice, I roll 5, and my rolling sucks. And so he still gets the spell, and he completely destroys my units of hybrid cavalry. And now he's in the back lines, so I'm not able to deal with him anymore, which is terrible news. Also, he manages to be in range to scream at my spearmen, and he kills a handful of them. Of course, in combat in the center of the board, his 2 main bricks destroy my light cavalry, and then they reform to face and get better angles on the rest of the units that I have. So here I skipped one of my turns. Here, as you can see, my spearman went into a close combat battle against his units, his great weapon skeletons. I didn't have much of a chance at that point because I tried to do another charge with the tower guard, the black guard, that's just out of the frame, but they failed, and so now I'm only able to get my spearmen into the combat, which is not what I was hoping for. So yeah, that was terrible luck. In the fighting round that exudes, as you can see, he destroyed basically half of my unit. I also killed about 10 of his skeleton warriors, but that's not enough to break him. I lose by a couple of points and my spearmen stick, but they're not going to be there for much longer. I also get Unity in Divergence on my spearmen to give them a 5-up save against his attacks, which is better than nothing, but it's not going to change the result of the battle. So in order to gain some time on that flank, I move the other unit of light cavalry right in the way so that his units are going to be stuck, at least for a couple of rounds. I also had a plan B, which was to charge one of my hunting chariots, the one that fled before, right into his specters, hoping that he was going to survive at least one round of combat and to keep that unit at bay for some time. But in the fighting round, I am able to do no wounds, and he just scythes me to death. So again, they're going to be free to move on the next opponent's turn. Here instead, I am still fighting the freaking bat swarms. They just never die. That's because my opponent is able to raise them a couple of times, and I'm just very unlucky with my armor saves, and knights are dropping left and right, which is terrible news. And they are still alive with 3 wounds, 1 swarm remaining. At this point, I need to stall the enemy units because I'm running out of options. I only have my blackguard, which is able to deal with his infantry blocks, and they need to go into something that I know I can deal with, which at this point I think is the skeletons with the great weapons that are just a little on the left of this picture. So I decide to stall the skeletons with halberds with my Miss Leviathan, which moves right in the front, and also the zombies with my chariot. In my opponent's turn, he charges both of my units with his units because he knows that he's going to kill them eventually. He also moves his specters much closer to my lines, and he decides to move away his big skeletal bat monster right behind the hill so that I'm not able to shoot at him with any of my units. He gets another one of those pesky movement spells on his side specters. He moves right across my light cavalry and he destroys them completely once again. In the combat phase, his units finally kill all of my spearmen and only my battle standard bearer is left alive, and he decides to flee to save his life to fight another day, because we did do some damage again, but it's not quite enough to win the battle. In the next combat, my Miss Leviathan dies because he was chaff, I knew it. I do maybe a couple of wounds to the skeletons, but nothing really happens. He just completely gets flattened out by the halberds and the vampire lady. And also, as you can see right at the top, my chariot didn't actually manage to win against the zombies and was run down by the zombies, which was a terrible thing that I did not expect. In the next combat phase, I finally managed to kill with my knights the last swarm, so I need to charge into the zombies. You can see that there is one grave right in front of my knights, and you might wonder, what does that mean? Well, there were 20 zombies in the unit. I charge with my knights, I do a boatload of damage, I use all the power that I have, hoping to break them in one single combat turn, which would allow my knights to be free and do something else with their power. But alas, I do almost enough to break through. One zombie remains, and that means that my cavalry is stuck, that my opponent is able to turn the skeleton brick that is right down under this picture, and he's going to be able to charge into my general, which is terrible luck for me. And he does exactly that. His unit charges into the flank of my cavalry, and then there's going to be a very terrible fighting round for me. Right in the center, the unit of specters with the scythes, they are just able to move across the board, avoid any of my attempts to deal with them. I try to shoot at them with my crossbows, and as you can see, I've killed a couple of them, but I'm not able to do significant damage, and so at the end, they managed to scream my blackguard off the table without me being able to actually use my blackguard in any type of combat. And finally, his graveguard catches my BSP. They fight for a while, but they just have great weapons. They pass through his armor and they just kill him. In the battle, I actually challenged his vampire with my general, hoping to deal some damage and to hopefully kill the vampire lord. We both do a wound to each other, which was quite an interesting result. I did not expect my hero to survive that. But still, I lose combat because he charges me in the flank with a lot of ranks, with a huge unit, so my general flees. However, my opponent placed a unit of dogs right in the middle, and so my general manages to flee through them, and he is now safe from anyone trying to reach him, which was very lucky for me. Kind of a blunder from my opponent, but he didn't know what to do with that unit of wolves, and so he just parked them in a weird spot. Thankfully for me. And not only that, but in the next turn I'm able to rally my general, so he's able to stay alive, keep all of his points, and be safe for a while. However, what is this sound that I'm hearing? Something? A bat? What is this? Oh no! The bat monster that was still alive, hiding behind the hill, has decided to come up again. He gets close to my general, in screaming range, he screams, and he kills him entirely. You're wondering, how? Well, doesn't your general have all the protection in the world? Well, technically yes, but the damage that this monster bat gives completely goes through any armor saves, which is the only real thing that saves my general in fighting. And so, he wounds him twice, I don't have any save, and my general is dead. This is the last picture of the battle, which as you can see is the final showdown between his major damage unit, which are the specters with scythes, and my crossbows. He screams at me, he does a boatload of wounds, but I thankfully managed to stay in the battle thanks to a good discipline check. So, this is the end of the battle, and as you can see, my Dread Elves suffered a terrible defeat. This is why I told you that dead men tell no tales. Well, Dead Elves also do that, apparently. And now I'm telling you this just because a couple of crossbowmen survived the onslaught. Again, my plan backfired once I moved my light cavalry right in the center to try to do the sandwich. That is because my opponent realized that staying in the center of the board was not going to bring him anywhere, and so he decided to just go for it. There were a couple of dicey situations where this battle could have been in my favor, but alas, it was a learning curve, for me at least. This was my first battle with the new list, so I'm still getting the hang of a couple of things, and hopefully the next battle is going to be much more interesting. But moving forward, I am already planning the next video, which is going to be a remake, or actually a preparation video, since I need to get the Miss Leviathan, or Misty, which is a gender-neutral monster, just to clarify, to get it ready for the tournament. The reason is that I have to make a bigger base for it, and I also need to place the Lash Masters on it, because the model requires these objects to be on it, and I just want him to look pretty good. So the next video is probably going to be a how-to video in order to make the Miss Leviathan look good. So thank you again for watching. I hope you had some fun watching this terrible, terrible example of a battle, at least on my end, and I hope I can see you in the next one. Bye bye!